Giving Changi Airport a boost, Singapore may set up leisure travel green lanes with countries where COVID-19 is under control.
As Singapore continues to battle new infections, we speak to one expert about what the true infection rate is in the dormitories.
So job preservation, in my mind, is foremost.
NTUC Chief Ng Chee Meng tells us more than 20,000 job seekers have been matched with employers since the pandemic began.
Good evening, you're watching The Big Story, coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. I'm Olivia Quay.
And I'm Haryanto Diman. Now you can subscribe to the Straits Times channel so you never miss a single episode. Now these news just in, Deputy Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat will deliver a ministerial statement on Monday on how the government will continue its support for workers and businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic.
He will deliver the statement at 3:30 p.m. Now, measures announced during the 4 budgets so far this year include the Job Support Scheme for wage subsidies and cash transfers for households.
Now, in other news, for the first time since June 1st, there are 0 community cases among the 83 new COVID-19 cases reported today.
But there are 4 imported cases who had been placed on stay-home notices upon their arrival in Singapore. Meanwhile, work permit holders currently under quarantine form the majority of the other cases, and more details will be released later tonight.
Meanwhile, the government may consider introducing reciprocal green lanes at Changi Airport for tourists from countries where the COVID-19 situation is similar to or better than Singapore. In his maiden speech to his staff, Transport Minister Ong Ye Kung said that the arrangement could also be a way to help lift the passenger numbers at Changi Airport to about 40% of pre-COVID levels.
Under this arrangement, leisure travellers from countries or regions which have kept the virus under control will be exempted from having to serve the 14-day quarantine upon arrival here. Currently, Singapore has reciprocal green lane arrangements at the airport for visitors from China who are on business and official trips.
We're now joined by news editor Karamjit Kaur to discuss this further. Karamjit, Mr. Ong said he was told that COVID-19 has set Changi Airport back by at least 40 years to when Terminal 1 first opened. But if leisure travel hopefully restarts, what is the recovery timeline that we are looking at?
Hi, Haryanto. So I don't think we're looking at any immediate recovery. So Minister Ong has made a very interesting suggestion. He talks about how, if we want to help Changi Airport regain some of its lost traffic, then we need to look beyond just green lanes for business travel. But, how that's going to pan out, whether it works, will travelers actually, want to return to the skies? These are all questions that need to be answered, and even if, Singapore does manage to set up such arrangements with, like-minded countries, you still need to talk about, testing procedures and all that. If you remember the arrangements we have as far as business travel is concerned, it does require travelers to take several, PCR tests before you depart, when you arrive, and then, when you come back again. So that also adds to cost. So there are many things that need to be ironed out. And, hopefully if these things can be sorted out, we should see some sort of recovery for Changi. But I think, the industry is talking about the next 3 to 4 years for recovery. I think in the long term, that still would have to be the sort of timeline that we're looking at. So I think the thing that needs to be very clear is that recovery will continue to be quite slow.
Right. Well, Krama, earlier you mentioned about, like-minded countries having this arrangement with them, as well as, their testing capabilities. So if the green lanes for leisure travel do materialize, which countries then do you think will be the first few to be part of this arrangement? And I guess back to the timeline question, how early do you think it will happen?
I would imagine that, if you look at the arrangements we have with countries when it comes to business travel, those would be the same countries you would expect we would also want to work with for leisure travel. So China, for example, I would imagine would be, one of the early countries we want to do this with. Malaysia is probably another one, because, we have this arrangement with Malaysia to allow also, Malaysians who used to work in Singapore to come back. So I would say China, Malaysia, probably the first two. And then you look at Australia, for example. I mean, notwithstanding what's happening in the state of Victoria, the rest of Australia seems to be okay. So we might expect some of these arrangements for leisure travelers, if it works out, to also include some parts of Australia and maybe some parts of New Zealand as well. Um, Japan also, of course. We've just announced a green lane for business travel with Japan. So these are some of the countries that I would imagine, Singapore would be looking at if we wanted to do something similar for leisure travelers. In terms of timeline, um, it really, it's a little hard to say. It depends on how the pandemic sort of like plays out in these countries. I think we've seen with a lot of countries, with a lot of states, it's a second wave of infections can happen very quickly. So it is very dynamic. But I would imagine the first such arrangement, I mean, theoretically could happen before the end of this year if there is commitment or, on both sides as far as Singapore and the next country is concerned.
Right. Karam, again, we want to stress that these are just plans and suggestions, but if they do materialize, do you expect a lot of Singaporeans to start booking their tickets and packing their luggage, especially after not being able to travel for several months?
So I think it's really very early days. At the end of the day, whether a person wants to travel or not, I mean, look, clearly the demand is there. There is a very strong appetite. There's a lot of COVID fatigue that has set in. If you look at some of the hotels in Singapore, for example, that have started to offer staycations, the demand for that seems to be quite strong. So clearly people want to still start to do stuff, and they do want to travel, but at the end of the day, there's also certain level of concern. When we read about all this second wave of infections in other countries, if I wanted to think about traveling, I would be a bit worried about that. And also, ultimately, it all boils down to cost, right? So, for a business traveler, coming up with like $800 to $1,000 to do 3-4 tests might be something feasible and viable. But would a leisure traveler want to do that? I think bit of a question mark there. So, at the end of the day, it's a lot of things that people will have to consider, before they sort of decide, do I want to pack my bags or not? So these are some of the questions that you need to ask yourself as well, Haryanto.
All right, well, you are right, Karoma. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. Always a pleasure to speak with you. We were speaking to news editor Karamjit Kaur.
Now, based on Singapore's official tally of COVID-19 cases, about 1 in 6 foreign workers living in dormitories have contracted the virus. But according to experts, the true infection rate in the dorms is likely higher. The same goes with the general population.
In most countries, infections are missed by the official case count, which occur because a person with a negative result at the point of testing may become infected in the future or may have recovered from a previous infection. So these cryptic infections are probably around 5 to 10 times greater than the official count. And the only way to know the true infection rate would be to conduct large-scale serological tests.
We're pleased to welcome Associate Professor Alex Cook to the show. He's the Vice Dean of Research at NUS's Swee Hock School of Public Health. Now, Prof. Cook, we estimate that around 1 in 6 foreign workers have been infected with COVID-19, but that number is likely higher as asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic cases could result in underreporting infections. Given that, how high is the risk of new outbreaks in the dormitories?
So I think we need to acknowledge that in most countries there is a risk of substantial numbers of undiagnosed infections. And that's not unique to Singapore. Most countries are reporting maybe tenfold more infections than they're actually identifying as cases. I suspect that within the dorms we've done a much better job of identifying more of those milder infections that in many other places we wouldn't identify. But I think it's unrealistic to think that all of the infections have been identified. And so depending on how many infections we have missed, that will determine whether we are at a level of herd immunity in the dorms, which would protect us from other second waves of the outbreak.
Now, Prof. Cook, if the true infection rate in the dorms is indeed higher to the point of herd immunity levels, is herd immunity then a strategy we can explore just within the dorms to ensure any outbreak there would be small?
Yes, in theory, moving workers around between more badly affected rooms and less badly affected rooms is one way that we can try to standardize the overall level of immunity to reduce pockets of immunonaive workers, people who have not been infected before, and therefore reduce the risk of larger outbreaks reoccurring within the dormitories.
Well, Prof, say Singapore's true infection rate, like with most countries, is around 5 to 10 times higher than the official count, as you mentioned before. Do our current COVID-19 response measures then reflect adequate protection for the general population, or are they only adequate in relation to the officially diagnosed cases?
That's a very good question. So our interventions have multiple layers precisely because we know that what will work for a confirmed case will not work for the undiagnosed cases. So for infections that we know about, then we know how to deal with them very easily. We isolate them from their contacts and their families. We make sure that they're in hospital under care, and we quarantine their contacts and monitor them carefully for any infection. So that's handled by that layer of our response. But a lot of the other layers that we currently implement, things like wearing masks when we're in public, the purpose of that is to deal with those pre-symptomatic infections, so people who will develop symptoms later but are not yet showing symptoms, those with mild symptoms who don't think they've got COVID, they think they've got a normal cold or flu, and then those who are never going to be symptomatic but may still be infectious. And that's why we have to go through the pain of those population level interventions in order to prevent transmission from the less severe infections that we might be missing and not diagnosing.
Right. Well, thanks very much for the insights, Professor Cook. We've been speaking to Associate Professor Alex Cook, Vice Dean of Research at the Swee Hock School of Public Health at NUS.
Also making local headlines, from Monday, construction companies which need help with applying to restart work can go to two help centres set up by the Building and Construction Authority. Called Restart Clinics, the centres are housed at BCA's premises in Braddell and Jurong East.
National Development Minister Desmond Lee announced this in a Facebook post today after a visit to the Cascaden Reserve condominium worksite, which has been allowed to resume work. To prevent intermingling, the worksite is segregated into zones and there are staggered timings for the start and end of work. Temporary quarters for workers and staff, as well as a sick bay and isolation room, are also features in this worksite.
The food delivery vertical of Southeast Asia's biggest ride-hailing firm Grab has overtaken its transport division to be its biggest business segment. This comes as COVID-19 measures put millions of people in the region under lockdown, eroding demand for its transport business. So nearly 150,000 of its drivers have switched to becoming delivery men for homebound customers. Grab's finance business has also been boosted by surging digital payments and small businesses seeking working capital loans.
The National Wages Council will reconvene in the next 2 weeks to review its guidelines for a second time this year. The council said since the last update in March, the labour market has weakened considerably and it's aiming to release new guidance by September. The guidelines issued 5 months ago recommended that employers should first reduce non-wage costs and consider measures to use and manage excess manpower. It also stated that layoffs should be the last resort.
Meanwhile, NTUC Chief Ng Chee Meng says more than 20,000 job seekers have found new roles thanks to its job matching service. Since the COVID-19 pandemic hit, NTUC has partnered with unions and companies to identify suitable positions to match workers with employers.
Our manpower correspondent Joanna Xiao asked Mr. Ng if preventing retrenchments or encouraging hiring is more important right now.
I can do both at the same time. It is not an exclusive method that I only do job preservation, I don't do job creation. I can do both because the economy is wide, there are different possibilities, different sectors that may be in deeper difficulties. Some there are growth sectors, and especially in government. How can we actually find the whole spectrum of possibilities to ensure that the economy recovers as fast as possible? Workers in these difficult, challenging times are able to find good, reasonable jobs. So job preservation, in my mind, is foremost. So the whole strategy really is preserve jobs where we need to protect workers, and furthermore, if there are retrenchments, how to provide care support like job matching to our workers. Job matching is an area that I think there is much work that we can do in terms of actually the levels of job creation, getting folks into preferred industries, and then persuading where the industry is really challenged into new industries.
The NWC is going to be reconvening soon.
Yes.
Do you have any, in effect, a wish list, or what do you hope they will look at?
Well, I think for NWC, I support the reconvening so that we can look at all the different measures. Foremost, job preservation, which is a big component of business. How can we actually look at possibilities to partner companies, at the same time look after the welfare of workers, for example, low-wage workers. In such circumstances, well, if there are certain agreements of wage freeze, wage cuts, whatever it may be, will we be able to make sure that low-wage workers are taken care of? So all these different things would be discussed, but foremost in my mind, preserving jobs for Singaporeans, extending the protection, extending the preservation of jobs, and where we can, provide the care and support for workers.
And that was NTUC Chief Ng Chee Meng. Now you can read the full story by Joanna Seow on our website, that is straitstimes.com.
Good evening, I'm Dylan Ang. Let's take a look at the global headlines. The whole of New Zealand will remain under lockdown measures until 11:59 p.m. on August 26, after Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern extended these by 12 days. Ms. Ardern also announced 13 new COVID-19 infections today, taking the number of active cases in the country to 49. Indonesia's capital, Jakarta, also extended its social restrictions in the wake of surging coronavirus transmissions. Jakarta logged 608 new cases yesterday, the most among Indonesia's 34 provinces. Restaurants, places of worship and public transportation will now operate at limited capacity until August 27th. Thailand's pay-to-stay visa program for wealthy foreigners is looking to expand, with visions of the country becoming a haven for expats thanks to its relative success in containing the coronavirus. The Thailand Elite Card is a residential visa program for affluent expats, investors and long-stay groups. It's a renewable 5-year visa with membership ranging from 500,000 to 2 million baht. Managing to hold up during the pandemic, it forecasts 2,288 new enrollees in the fiscal year through September, up 6.8% from the previous year. Stateside, the US Justice Department accused Yale University of violating US civil rights law by illegally discriminating against white and Asian American applicants. The findings claim that these two groups have only 1/10 to 1/4 of the likelihood of admission compared to African American applicants with similar academic credentials. They come after a 2-year investigation into the admission process at the prestigious Ivy League university. And in the world of sports, women's world number 6 and reigning US Open champion Bianca Andreescu will not defend her title at Flushing Meadows, citing the COVID-19 pandemic for her inability to properly prepare for the event. She joins other top 10 players like Ashley Barty and Elina Svitolina in skipping the Grand Slam. And those are the headlines around the world. It's back to you guys in the studio.
Thank you, Dylan. Now it's a sad day for the SPH family today. Jamie Meldrum, former DJ and senior program director at KISS 92 and 1FM 91.3 has died. He was 50 years old.
Jamie was also head of creative at the two stations and frequently did local and regional voice-over work for animations and commercials. Our condolences to SPH Radio and his family and friends.
You can visit straitstimes.com for more news and videos, and of course subscribe to our YouTube channel by hitting the red button below.
Once again, I'm Haryanto Diman with Olivia Quay. Enjoy your weekend and we'll see you next week.